There are in every English market town a few buildings that appear to be quietly waiting for something, a visitor, perhaps, or a memory that forgot to die. In Flaxborough, that place was the old rectory, a square grey Georgian house behind overgrown lilacs and a sagging gate, long empty since Canon Willisden's death a decade ago. It was, therefore, with mild alarm and considerable curiosity that Reverend Lionel Moffat, newly installed curate of St. Swithin's, looked from his bedroom window that Thursday evening and saw a candle burning in the drawing-room of the derelict rectory. The light was not electric. It moved with the unsteady rhythm of a flame, swaying faintly as if carried by someone who knew their way through the furniture. For a moment, the Reverend imagined he saw a silhouette, a person standing still, half-turned toward the window. Then the light dipped, flared, and vanished. He stared for several seconds longer, heart ticking in that way which is not quite fear, but distinctly related to it. The rectory had been locked for years. He knew that much. The keys were held, he believed, by the parish solicitor. He telephoned the police. Inspector Purbright did not, as a rule, rush to ghost sightings. His desk, he liked to remark, was haunted enough by paperwork. But this call came from Reverend Moffat, newly appointed, painfully earnest, and so fresh from theological college that he still said "good heavens" without irony. By the time Purbright arrived at the rectory, Sergeant Malley was already there, shining his torch along the ivy-strangled walls. The gate creaked open as though surprised to be used. "Inside, sir," said Malley. "Front door wasn't forced. Lock looks old, but not recently turned." Purbright entered first. His torch played across the hall. Dust, damp wallpaper, a few mouse droppings, and the faint smell of stale flowers. Long dead, yet still perfuming the air with the suggestion of former gentility. "Drawing room's through there," said Malley, pointing. "Found this on the floor." It was a candle, half melted, stuck in a brass holder blackened by heat. The wax had pooled in a little white island upon the floorboards. No footprints, no signs of intrusion. Yet the candle was not ancient. It had burned recently. Purbright bent and touched the wax, still faintly warm. "Curate says he saw someone?" he asked. "Yes, sir. Claims the figure was holding the light." Purbright nodded, examining the candlestick. "This pattern," he murmured. "They used to sell them at Dunn's before the fire in '52. Local make, if memory serves." Malley looked puzzled. "You think someone local lit it, sir?" "I think," Purbright replied, placing the candlestick on the mantelpiece, "that whoever lit it knew what sort of impression it would make." He turned slowly, studying the room. Furniture shrouded in dust sheets. A piano missing half its keys. A writing desk, drawers, askew, one open, revealing a small, framed photograph face down inside. Purbright lifted it. A woman's portrait, late Victorian, her eyes caught in that fixed, faintly amused expression old cameras imposed. On the back, faint ink. "To my dearest William." "See." He replaced it carefully. "The late Canon's wife," he said softly. "Died young, I believe." Outside, the curate hovered like a schoolboy, afraid of both sin and ridicule. "I assure you, Inspector," he said, as Purbright emerged, "the light was there. I thought, well, one reads about such things, the soul returning to its home." Said Purbright. "And did it seem a happy soul, Reverend, or merely punctual?" The Reverend coloured. I didn't stay long enough to determine that." Purbright smiled. "Sensibly done." He glanced up at the dark windows. "You said you saw the candle in the drawing-room. About what time?" "Just after 10. "And you're certain no one else could have entered? Keys, perhaps?" "The solicitor, Mr. Cundall, Holds the only set, I'm told. Purbright nodded. Then we'll have a word with Mr. Cundall. Candles do not light themselves, however nostalgic they may be for company. By morning the town had already christened it the Candlelight Visitor. Mrs. Glossop, over her first customer's scone, declared that the late Mrs. Willesden has come back to check whether her husband's sermons have improved. Mr. Hopwood, from the ironmongers, preferred a more modern theory involving burglars and gas leaks, and Miss Teatley, who ran the library, simply remarked that it was rather like life in Flaxborough, everything half-lit and half-forgotten. Inspector Purbright, reading these remarks later in the Flaxborough Chronicle, allowed himself the faintest of smiles. He had already asked Sergeant Malley to look into two matters: whether any of the late canon's personal effects, particularly his wife's photograph, had ever been catalogued or sold, and whether any local shop, antique or otherwise, had been recently buying or selling old Flaxborough-made candles. It was, he reflected, a trivial beginning. Yet Flaxborough's quieter mysteries often began that way, with a flicker of light in a place long thought dark. By breakfast the next morning, the Candlelight Visitor had achieved the rare distinction of being discussed simultaneously in 3 barbers' chairs, 2 grocers' queues, and the Ladies' Fellowship Knitting Circle, the latter of which, by 11 o'clock, had reached the conclusion that the apparition had been female, bereaved, and possibly Anglican. Flaxborough was a town where truth travelled on foot, but gossip took the omnibus. At the Tea Cosy Cafe, Mrs. Glossop presided over her empire of steam and chatter, wielding a teapot as if it were both sceptre and microphone. "You mark my words," she told her morning customers. "It's her, back again, the canon's wife, Mrs. Willesden. They said she died peaceful, but I never believed it. She had the look of a woman with unfinished business, the sort that hides bank statements in hymn books." Mr. Hopwood, from the ironmongers, snorted. "Ghosts don't need bank statements, they need plumbers. That old place leaks like a sieve." "Perhaps it's not her ghost," said Miss Teatley, the librarian, who had dropped in for a scone and an audience. "Perhaps it's someone who wants people to think it's her ghost. That's more interesting, don't you agree?" Mrs. Glossop narrowed her eyes. "You're too clever by half, Miss Teatley. Mark me, there's something romantic in it. A secret admirer. Candlelight, after all, is for wooing." The group chuckled, all except Mrs. Sproat, who maintained a face of chronic disapproval, and said firmly, "Nothing romantic about breaking and entering." At the police station, Inspector Purbright was rereading his own notes. Empty house, locked front door, no forced entry. 1 melted candle, local manufacture, drawer open, photograph of Canon Willesden's wife, C. He turned the page. Reverend Lionel Moffat, age 32, single, nervous disposition, mild stammer when questioned, over-anxious to appear truthful. Purbright tapped the pencil against the margin. He did not dislike Moffat, but in fact he pitied him. Young clergymen, Purbright had observed, often suffered from moral indigestion, too much virtue swallowed too quickly, not yet digested by experience. "Malley," he said as the sergeant entered, "what did we learn from Mr. Cundall, the solicitor?" Malley flipped open his notebook. "Claims he still has the keys, sir. Keeps them in his office safe. Hasn't opened the rectory in years." "Quite so," murmured Purbright. "And yet someone did lit a candle that hasn't been sold since before 1955. Curious thing to bring along on a burglary." "Could have been lying around inside?" Purbright shook his head. "No, the wax was white. Local candles back then used tallow and came out cream or yellow. Whoever lit it brought it with them. Sentimental, perhaps." "Sentimental, sir?" "Oh, very likely. Flaxborough's full of it. Mostly about the wrong people." That afternoon, Purbright took a slow walk down Chancel Lane, the road that bordered the churchyard and the rectory grounds. A drizzle hung in the air, polite English rain that couldn't quite commit to being inconvenient. He nodded to Mrs. Sproat, who was pruning her hydrangeas with missionary zeal. "Terrible goings-on, Inspector," she called. "I do hope you'll find who's responsible before next Sunday. We've enough sinners without importing more." "I shall do my best to limit the influx," he replied, pausing. "Did you happen to notice anyone near the rectory recently? Any lights, visitors?" She sniffed. "Only that new curate, creeping about after dark, the Lord knows why. I saw him Tuesday night through my curtains. He pretends he doesn't smoke, but I distinctly saw a glow." "Indeed," said Purbright mildly. "You're quite sure it wasn't candlelight?" Mrs. Sproat looked indignant. "Inspector, I know the difference between a cigarette and a haunting." By evening, the story had grown legs. A local rag, the Flaxborough Chronicle, ran a headline, "Candlelight Spectre Returns to Old Rectory." Police baffled. Purbright read it over his supper, sighed faintly, and remarked to Mally, "Bafflement in journalism is a convenient synonym for insufficient patience." "Should we tell them it's not a spectre, sir?" "Good heavens, no, we'd ruin the week's entertainment." He folded the paper neatly. "But we will speak again with Reverend Moffat. A man who reports a ghost may have seen something rather more earthly, and said ghost may yet have left a trace." The curate received them in his small study behind the church. The rooms smelt of paper and damp cassocks. Moffat himself looked paler than yesterday, though his handshake was determined. "I've been rather teased about the matter," he admitted nervously. "Several parishioners have offered me exorcism salts." Purbright smiled gently. "A generous impulse, if somewhat premature. Tell me, Reverend, you're quite sure no one has access to the rectory? No cleaners, parish committees, or charitable rummagers?" "None, Inspector. The place has been empty since Canon Willisden's time." Purbright glanced at a framed photograph on the desk. A group of clergy at a diocesan luncheon. One face caught his eye. Canon Willisden himself, smiling faintly beside a younger Moffat, whose expression suggested mild unease even then. "You knew him then?" Purbright asked casually. "Briefly. As a student curate years ago, he was rather formidable." "Indeed? And his wife?" A pause. "I never met her. She died before my time." Purbright nodded, his gaze wandering to a dusty shelf. "You've inherited quite a few of his books, I see." "Yes, the church had no use for them. I found them stored in the vestry. Sermons, mostly." "Of course," Purbright said softly. "Theology often survives its author better than most reputations." The curate looked uncertain whether this was meant kindly. When they left, Sergeant Mally said, "Odd sort, that vicar." "Not odd, Mally, merely conscientious. Conscience is exhausting when overused." They passed the rectory again on their way back. The drizzle had ceased. The air was faintly misted. Through the tangle of lilac and nettle, the house loomed, its windows opaque, blind. Purbright stopped. "Do you notice something peculiar, Mally?" The sergeant peered. "Not particularly, sir. Looks deserted as ever." Purbright pointed to a faint reflection in one of the upper panes. There, a glint, possibly glass inside a frame. "Mirror, sir? Or photograph?" He looked thoughtful. "The one of Mrs. Willisden, perhaps. Someone placed it back upright." They said nothing more, but the night breeze rustled the lilac leaves with a sound uncomfortably like whispering. The next morning, a note awaited Purbright on his desk. It was from Miss Teatley, written on library stationery. "Inspector, if you are investigating the matter of the rectory, you may wish to know that a gentleman called this morning asking for books on early Flaxborough parishes. particularly Canon Willisden's term. He left no name, but he smelt faintly of candle wax. Purbright smiled, folded the note, and slipped it into his pocket. "Ah," he murmured. "A haunting of the intellect, then? That's much more serious." The morning after Miss Teatley's note, Inspector Purbright arrived at the Flaxborough and District Solicitor's offices with the unhurried air of a man visiting for a tax clarification rather than a haunting. The brass plate on the door read Cundell, Meacham and Co., though everyone in town knew there hadn't been a Meacham in 20 years. The surviving partner, Mr. Edwin Cundell, was a broad, moist sort of man whose spectacles were perpetually fogged by self-importance. "Inspector Purbright," he said, as if addressing a member of the clergy with doubtful orthodoxy. "What brings you to our humble premises? Nothing serious, I trust?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Only a little illumination, Mr. Cundell. Of the candlelight variety." Cundell's eyebrows twitched. "Ah, you refer to the rectory incident." "I do. You're listed as the custodian of the property. You hold the keys, I believe?" "Indeed. Both sets. In my office safe. The late Canon's estate is still in abeyance." Purbright glanced around the office, dusted ledgers, an umbrella stand containing more cobweb than cloth. "Abeyance?" "Yes. His widow, you see, died intestate, and there were complications. The diocese wished to dispose of the property, but a certain relative objected." "Relative?" "A nephew, I think, moved abroad. Some talk of his returning, though I've not seen him." Purbright nodded slowly. "So the house remains locked?" "Quite." "Then I suppose you've not visited it yourself recently?" Cundell blinked. "Good heavens, no. What would I be doing in that dusty mausoleum?" Purbright smiled, as though the remark had confirmed something rather than dismissed it. "You wouldn't, I'm sure. Thank you for your time, Mr. Cundell." He turned to leave, then paused at the door. "By the way, do you recall the late Canon's wife's Christian name?" Cundell frowned, surprised. "Caroline, I think. Why?" "No reason, only curiosity." The next stop was Wharton's Antiques, a narrow shop crammed with polite decay. The bell above the door gave a nervous ring as Purbright entered. Mr. Wharton himself emerged from the gloom, small, wiry, and dressed as though auditioning for a Dickens revival. "Inspector, haven't seen you since the affair of the brass umbrella stands." "Yes," said Purbright dryly. "That was a thrilling episode in municipal theft. Tell me, have you ever done business with the church, particularly the rectory?" Wharton pursed his lips. "Ah, the old rectory. Lovely furniture once, sir. Georgian walnut, decent patina. But the parish wouldn't sell. Said they were keeping it in memory. The canon's widow's influence, that was. She was sentimental? Possessive, more like. Used to insist nothing be moved after the canon passed. Kept his slippers by the hearth for 3 years, so I was told." Purbright's eyebrow rose. "Indeed? You never bought anything from the property?" "No, sir. Though about 6 months ago someone came asking if I'd value a certain brass candlestick, old Flaxborough make. Said he'd found it among family effects. Wanted to know if they fetched anything these days." "And did they?" Wharton grinned. 3 shillings at best." "Can you describe the man?" "Tallish. Wore a raincoat. Spoke with that educated sort of accent people put on for funerals, paid in cash, no name given." Purbright nodded thoughtfully. "And this was 6 months ago?" "Yes, sir. Why? Has someone been lighting the antiques on fire?" "Not quite," said Purbright. "Just one candle, but with unusually modern taste for nostalgia. By the afternoon, Sergeant Malley had compiled a list of all those with possible keys or access to the rectory grounds. Mr. Cundell, solicitor, claims both sets secure. Church caretaker, one Thomas Peveril, has old garden access, diocesan surveyor, visited 3 months prior Reverend Moffat, newly appointed keys to vestry only, Peveril, Purbright repeated, tapping the name. He's the one who used to tend Canon Willesden's garden, isn't he? Yes, sir. Bit slow these days, lives by the river. Let's have a word with him. They found Thomas Peveril behind his cottage, smoking a pipe that had possibly outlived its owner's lungs. His garden was a jungle of patient neglect. Rectory? He said when asked. I still go by sometimes, old habits. Grounds need seeing to, else the weeds take liberties. You have a key then? Purbright asked mildly. Old one. Doesn't fit proper no more. Been rusted since the canon's time. You knew the canon well? Peveril's eyes misted. He was a fair man. Strict mind. Didn't much care for visitors. Nor did she, the missus. Said the house was private sanctuary, whatever that means. And after she passed? Didn't go in after that. Bad luck, they said, but now and then I'd see a light upstairs. Purbright looked up sharply. A light? Aye. Thought it were kids, maybe. But no one ever broke in, far as I could tell. When was this? Year or so ago, once or twice, always about 10 at night. Purbright exchanged a glance with Mally. Did you mention it to anyone? Didn't think it worth bothering the police with ghosts, said Peveril, shrugging. You lot prefer burglars. Purbright smiled faintly. We like variety. That evening, Purbright sat in his office, the day's notes arranged like dominoes waiting for a push. A solicitor, with too much caution, a curate with too much conscience, a caretaker with too much superstition, and, somewhere between them, a single melted candle that should not exist. He took out Miss Teatley's note again. A gentleman asking for books on early Flaxborough parishes. There was something uncomfortably deliberate about that, someone brushing close to the past, testing the dust to see what it might conceal. He leaned back and looked through the window at the quiet street beyond. The lamplight flickered on the rain-streaked glass like a candle in a shuttered room. He smiled to himself. Mally, he said when the sergeant appeared, we'll pay a visit to the library tomorrow. I'd like to meet this learned candle enthusiast. It may be that he's been enlightening us all in more ways than one. It was the curse of Flaxborough, Inspector Purbright sometimes thought, that it could never resist the comfort of a simple answer. Before he had even left the police station the next morning, word had reached him that the Candlelight visitor had been positively identified, or rather, nominated, as that tramp from the river. Sergeant Mally brought the news with a faint air of triumph, as if the case were a crossword clue just solved by committee. Name of Jack Lomer, sir. Sleeps rough along the embankment. Couple of locals saw him near the Rectory Lane Tuesday night, carrying a lantern. Purbright looked up from his paperwork with mild amusement. A lantern, you say? Excellent. Soon we shall have him pegged as a fireman. Mally, accustomed to such irony, grinned sheepishly. He's been known to do a bit of scavenging, sir. Old copper, bottles, that sort. Could have been after scrap. Purbright murmured. And after all, why risk theft from anywhere else when one might burgle the diocese for the sake of moral development? He rose, putting on his hat. Let's go meet this philanthropic ghost hunter. Jack Lomer turned out to be younger than expected, perhaps 40, but weathered into anonymity by rain and railway soot. They found him beneath the railway arch near the river, boiling tea in an old tin. He regarded them calmly, without civility. If you're looking for me about that light up the rectory, he said, before they'd spoken. It weren't me lit it. Purbright smiled. We're delighted you've saved us the trouble of introducing the topic. Lomer sipped his tea. It's all round the town. Every fool thinks they've seen something. I was up there night before, picking kindling from the hedge, but I don't go in houses, not even the dead ones." Mally frowned. "You've been near it, though?" "Near enough to see the ghosts of good taste," said Loma dryly. "Place looks like it died of boredom." Purbright chuckled. "A cultivated vagrant. What brings you to Flaxborough, Mr. Loma?" "Same as most. Bad luck and indifference." The inspector studied him for a moment, then said, "If you were in the vicinity Tuesday, you might have seen someone else there." "Maybe," said Loma. "Saw a shadow moving near the lilacs, didn't stop. Looked like a man in a hat. Tall." "Did he see you?" "Don't think so." Purbright nodded. "Thank you. We'll not keep you from your tea." As they left, Mally muttered, "He's probably lying, sir." "Quite possibly," Purbright said, "but not about the hat. The untruthful rarely bother with haberdashery." By afternoon, however, the Flaxborough Chronicle had printed a second piece. Local tramp sought in Candlelight enquiry. Police investigate vagrants' movements on night of mystery illumination. Purbright sighed when he read it. "It's always a relief to learn what we're investigating," he said mildly. "I was beginning to worry it might be the weather." Later that day, Purbright and Mally called once again upon Reverend Moffat, who received them with visible nervousness. His teacup rattled faintly against the saucer. "I suppose," he said. "You've seen the paper. Dreadful business. Poor man, I hope he's not guilty." "Hope," said Purbright, "is the one commodity most freely distributed during investigations." The curate blushed. "I only meant—" "It's all rather disturbing. There's talk that the rectory's haunted again." "Again?" "Yes. Canon Willisden's death caused quite the stories. People said he never left." Purbright looked up. "Never left?" "Well, spiritually. Some say his papers vanished, church accounts and such. The diocese was uneasy." Purbright considered him a moment longer. "You never found any of those missing papers, I suppose?" "No," said Moffat quickly. "None at all." There was something in his haste that made the inspector's expression sharpen almost imperceptibly. At the library, Miss Teatley was waiting with the air of one delighted to be useful to authority without appearing to enjoy it too openly. "I kept the man's description, Inspector," she said, handing him a note. Tall grey coat, hat pulled down, asked for books on Canon Willisden, specifically his final sermons. He seemed disappointed when I said the parish copies were missing. "Missing?" "Yes. Supposedly misfiled years ago." "Indeed," Purbright murmured. "And what time was this visit?" 10 minutes before closing yesterday morning." "Did he give his name?" "No, but he signed the visitor ledger with initials only. C.W. Purbright smiled faintly. "Our late canon's initials were W.C.W., I believe." "They were," said Miss Teatley, eyes bright. "Do you think—" "I think," Purbright said gently, "that if the dead do read sermons, they tend not to borrow them by library card." That evening, Purbright walked alone past the churchyard. The autumn light was fading into the kind of soft gloom that makes even decent people look guilty. The rectory windows reflected the sky like dark mirrors. He stood a moment at the gate, noting the padlock, old but intact, and the faint trace of fresh mud near the steps. He stooped, touching the mark. Bootprint, narrow, well-made, not the size of a tramp's heavy soles. When he straightened, Mrs. Sproat's voice came from behind the hedge. "Evening, Inspector. Back to look for phantoms?" "Only the material sort," he said. She sniffed. "You won't find them there. I told the vicar to sprinkle holy water, but he said it's Anglican property. Can't waste diocesan funds." "Very prudent," said Purbright. "Tell me, Mrs. Sproat, did you notice anyone by the house since our last talk?" Only that solicitor fellow, Mr. Cundle. Went in last night. I saw his car by the gate. Purbright turned slowly. You're sure? Quite sure. I was setting the cat out. 10 o'clock sharp. He had a torch. Ah, said Purbright softly. Then perhaps the ghosts keep excellent legal representation. At the station, Malley looked up from his paperwork. Anything new, sir? Purbright hung up his coat, expression unreadable. Only that Mr. Cundle appears to visit properties he claims never to enter, and our mysterious reader signs with the initials of a man deceased for 10 years. Malley frowned. So what do we do next? Purbright smiled faintly. We allow the town another day of certainty. Then when they're quite sure it was the tramp, we'll quietly prove otherwise. That night, a light flickered once more in the window of the old rectory. Not a candle this time, but the pale, steady glow of an electric torch. It lasted less than a minute. Then darkness swallowed it whole. Inspector Purbright had always maintained that the smallest details in life were the most disorderly. Murder, theft, or deceit. These were tidy things once done. It was the small items left behind that untidied them again. The candle on his desk that morning was one such item. It sat on a square of brown paper, half melted, its wick black and crooked. Sergeant Malley stood opposite, holding a notebook like a shield. Test results came back from the lab, sir, Malley said, trying to sound official. It's made with beeswax, not tallow, apparently hand-dipped. Local make, but discontinued years ago. Purbright nodded. And the maker? Old firm called Grayson's. Went out of business in 57, used to sell through. Dunn's Hardware, that burned down. Purbright leaned back. We are pursuing a ghost who shops exclusively in extinct stores. Delightful. He looked again at the candle, running a finger along its uneven side. Tell me, Malley, did you happen to notice the pattern near the base, that faint line? Malley squinted. Looks like a scratch. It's not, it's a tooling mark. These candles came in sets, moulded in pairs. This one had a twin. So whoever lit it might still have the other one. Precisely, said Purbright. And that other candle, somewhere in Flaxborough, is still intact, waiting to tell us where it's been. By midday, Purbright had made an unobtrusive stop at Wharton's Antiques. Mr. Wharton looked up from polishing a decanter. Ah, back about the brass, Inspector? Not today, Mr. Wharton. Candles. Wharton blinked. Candles, sir? Yes, the sort sold by Grayson's years ago. You ever handled any since? Wharton chuckled. Good Lord, no. People these days prefer their fires in plugs. Might have had a few boxes once, though. Estate clear out in 60. Came from a house off Cannon's Lane. Purbright looked interested. Whose house? Can't recall. Might have been the Willesden place, when the church sent some things to auction. Purbright smiled faintly. The old rectory? That's the one. A lady from the diocese arranged it. Said the proceeds were for memorial purposes. And the candles sold? Oh, not at the sale. She took them back, said they'd been mislisted. Do you recall her name? Wharton frowned. Mrs. Cundle, perhaps. Related to the solicitor's wife. Purbright thanked him politely and left. Back at the station he found Miss Teatley waiting outside his office, library satchel in hand. I hope I'm not intruding, Inspector, she said primly, but I found something you may like to see. From her bag she produced a slim, leather-bound notebook, edges foxed with age. I was checking old catalogues. This was lodged behind the parish records. It's Canon Willesden's handwriting. Purbright turned the pages. Sermon notes, parish accounts. And one curious entry near the end, in faded ink. Must speak to Cundle regarding Caroline's will. Certain receipts missing. Fear impropriety. He looked up, his expression unreadable. May I keep this for now? Of course. I rather thought you'd find it enlightening. Indeed, said Purbright. Flaxborough's ghosts are developing a very professional vocabulary. That evening, Purbright paid a visit to Mr. Cundall. The solicitor received him stiffly, though his office smelled faintly of whisky and defensive furniture polish. "Inspector?" again, he said, with weary civility. "Forgive me, Mr. Cundall, just one or two trifles. Do sit down. You've quite stirred up the town with all this. Flaxborough stirs itself, I assure you. I merely watch the ripples." Cundall smiled without humour. "Yes, well, if you've come about last night, I was there on business. The diocese requested I check the property for insurance purposes." "At 10 o'clock?" Cundall blinked. "It was the only time I was free." "Ah, a conscientious man, even by candlelight." Cundall stiffened. "I used a torch, Inspector, I assure you. I have no interest in melodrama." "None at all," said Purbright pleasantly. "Still, while you were there, you didn't happen to light anything else? A small wax object, perhaps? Beeswax, local make, last produced in 1957. Cundall's eyes darted briefly to the mantelpiece, where a decorative candlestick stood unlit. Then he looked away. "Certainly not." Purbright followed the glance, noting the twin moulding at the base. He smiled gently. "I see. You'll forgive me. My curiosity burns easily." Outside, Malley was waiting in the car. "Well, sir?" Purbright settled into the seat, tapping his hat brim. "He has the other candle. You saw it?" "On the mantel. Brass holder, Grayson's make, unlit but recently polished. Our solicitor collects souvenirs from his clients, it seems." "You think he was the one at the rectory?" "I think he's frightened of being thought so." The following day, Reverend Moffat visited the station, uninvited and uneasy. "Inspector," he began, "I must confess something trivial but perhaps relevant." "Trivial confessions," said Purbright, "are often my favourites." Moffat twisted his hat in his hands. "I've been at the rectory once, 2 nights before the incident. Mr. Cundall asked me to accompany him, to verify the parish silver for insurance. I thought it odd, but he insisted." "And you did?" "Yes, he seemed nervous. Said there were rumours of squatters. I helped him check the cupboards. He took some papers. Old financial ledgers, I think." "Ledgers," Purbright repeated. "And you didn't mention this sooner?" "I didn't wish to cause trouble. He said it was a diocesan matter." Purbright regarded him kindly but shrewdly. "And did you happen to notice the candles?" Moffat blinked. "Candles? One lit on the mantelpiece, perhaps?" The Reverend hesitated. "There was one, already burning when we entered. I thought he'd lit it." Purbright smiled faintly. "He didn't." "Then who?" "Possibly the same person who has been lighting this entire case from the shadows, Reverend." That night, as he walked home through the drizzle, Purbright reflected on the curious consistency of human nature. Men, he thought, seldom fear ghosts until they've created one of their own. The melted candle was no supernatural token. It was a signal, a gesture meant to awaken memory and dread in equal measure. Someone, perhaps Cundall, perhaps another, was invoking the past to conceal something much more recent. He paused outside his office window, watching his own reflection framed by the lamplight. In the glass behind him, the faintest shimmer seemed to glow. A candle's reflection, flickering once before vanishing. He did not turn. "Not yet," he murmured. "Let them keep their ghosts a little longer." It was a truth generally acknowledged in Flaxborough that the only thing faster than rumour was confirmation by someone unqualified to give it. By the end of the week, the candlelight visitor had been promoted from a curiosity to a moral parable. The Chronicle hinted that certain persons of influence had been seen frequenting the rectory. The vicar's congregation whispered that the house might be a place of punishment for deceitful men. Inspector Purbright read these developments in the paper over his morning tea and remarked to Sergeant Malley, "I find it comforting that theology and journalism have finally achieved mutual understanding." That afternoon, Purbright decided to widen his circle of polite inquiries. The first to receive his courtesy call was Mr. Peveril, the elderly verger who had once tended the rectory gardens. Peveril's cottage smelled of pipe ash and neglected chrysanthemums. He ushered Purbright in with mild suspicion. "You're back about the old place, Inspector. Thought you'd solved it." "Blamed the tramp," they said. "Ah," Purbright smiled. "I find it unwise to conclude too soon. The truth dislikes being hurried." "Never thought much of that house," Peveril muttered. "Always seemed to breed secrets. When the canon died, folk said the drawers was empty, but he kept ledgers, he did. She burned half, I reckon." "She?" "The Mrs. Willsden, said she couldn't abide clutter." Purbright nodded. A common affliction among the morally tidy. "Then not long before she passed, she told me never to let Mr. Cundle near the place. Said he'd helped himself to enough already." Those were her words. Purbright raised an eyebrow. "Indeed? And yet he holds the keys." "World's full of ironies," said Peveril, tamping his pipe. "At least this one's local." Next, Purbright paid a visit to the parish secretary, Miss Beresford, a woman of such determined neatness that even her anxieties seemed alphabetized. She met him in the vestry, clutching a ledger as if it were both shield and credential. "Inspector, I do hope this isn't about the church accounts again. The last audit was perfectly respectable." "I'm sure it was," said Purbright, "but perhaps you can help me with some older records. Canon Willisden's time." "Oh dear, those are incomplete." "So I've heard." She lowered her voice. "There were whispers of irregularities, charitable funds, perhaps misfiled. The diocese wanted it kept quiet. Mr. Cundell handled everything. He was very firm about discretion." "Firmness," said Purbright mildly, "is the politest disguise for nervousness." She hesitated, then added, "After the canon's wife died, I found a note on her desk, just one line. It said, 'Forgive him, but don't trust him.' I didn't know what it meant, so I burned it." Purbright nodded, unsurprised. "Flaxborough's conscience, Miss Beresford, is mainly smoke." His third visit of the day took him to Mrs. Clarice Larkin, niece of the late canon's wife, a small, sharp-eyed woman who lived on the edge of town in a house that smelled of mothballs and moral superiority. "I can't imagine why you'd come to me, Inspector," she said, offering tea that seemed to resent being poured. "I barely knew my aunt. She was a difficult woman, proud, secretive. But then all the Willisdens were." "Did she ever speak of Mr. Cundell?" "Constantly," said Mrs. Larkin. "She thought him a thief in gentleman's clothing, claimed he'd arranged her husband's will for his own convenience. I told her to go to the authorities. She said she would, when the time was right. And when was that?" "She died 2 weeks later." "Ah," Purbright murmured. The time proved less punctual than the idea. Mrs. Larkin eyed him. "You think her death suspicious?" "I think," said Purbright, "that the dead are remarkably helpful when the living begin to panic." By the following morning, the threads of gossip had formed a sort of civic embroidery. Mrs. Sproat swore she'd seen the solicitor arguing with a shadow by the rectory gate. Miss Teatley reported that someone had attempted to borrow the canon's notebook from the police. And a boy from the post office found an unmarked envelope in the churchyard, containing half a melted candle and a single scrap of paper with the words, "You forgot one." Purbright studied the scrap carefully. The handwriting was angular, controlled. "Professional," he murmured. Solicitor's hand? Mally whistled. Cundell again? Most likely. But who was the message for? Me or himself? That afternoon, Purbright invited Mr. Cundell to tea at the station, a gesture of civility that in Flaxborough was understood to mean you're being investigated, but gently. Cundell arrived perspiring slightly, hat in hand. Inspector, I really must protest these constant visits. I have clients to attend. Purbright gestured to the chair. And I have tea to finish. We all bear our burdens. Cundell sat stiffly. If this is about that ridiculous candle again. It is, said Purbright pleasantly. Specifically the one you didn't light. I beg your pardon? Purbright poured tea. A curious message was found. You forgot one. Any idea what that might mean? Cundell went pale. None whatsoever. Purbright stirred his cup. I sometimes forget myself, though rarely in pairs. Candles, however, often do. They're sold that way. One at the rectory, one in your office. Rather a poetic symmetry. Cundell swallowed. If you're implying nothing, said Purbright. Only noting how much light a little wax can shed on old accounts. For a long moment, neither spoke. The clock ticked decorously. At last, Cundell said, You have no evidence. None yet, Purbright agreed, but ghosts have an inconvenient way of creating it. That evening, the inspector took a solitary walk along the river path, his mind sorting facts like cards. Cundell, anxious, deceitful, holding keys to a property whose past he'd profited from. Moffat, innocent, but easily used, dragged into the charade. And somewhere behind them both, the faint voice of the dead Mrs. Willesden, vengeful or symbolic, it hardly mattered. He reached the bridge, paused, and looked down at the slow, black water. A match flared briefly beside him. Lomer, the tramp, stepped from the shadows, pipe in hand. Evening, Inspector, he said quietly. You looking for ghosts again? Always, said Purbright. They make excellent company. Lomer nodded. You might find one soon. Saw the solicitor down there half an hour ago. Threw something into the river. Small, shiny. Purbright turned toward him. Which direction? Under the bridge. Sank fast. Thank you, Mr. Lomer. You've just saved me a night's paperwork. The tramp shrugged. Least I could do for a man who listens. Later that night, Purbright stood by the riverbank with a constable and a torch. After a few moments searching, the beam caught something glinting beneath the surface, a small brass object. It was the second candlestick, still faintly warm. In Flaxborough, excitement was an event that usually required either fireworks or an unexpected will. So when, at 10:30 on a windless Friday night, the old rectory was seen to be glowing from within, Mrs. Sproat took it as both a divine sign and a personal invitation to alert the entire neighbourhood. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, overcoat buttoned, expression unreadable, the house was surrounded by a semicircle of townspeople in nightclothes. Someone had called the fire brigade, though the flame, modest as a scandal at a christening, was already dying out. Sergeant Mally met him by the gate, torch in hand. Started in the drawing-room, sir. Curtains caught first. Not much damage, thank heaven. Purbright peered through the doorway. The air smelt of damp smoke and old secrets reluctantly released. What caused it? Bit of cloth stuffed in a lamp. Looked deliberate. Indeed, said Purbright, stepping over the threshold. Flaxborough's ghosts are becoming surprisingly enterprising. The drawing-room was blackened at the corners, the ghost of the fire still smouldering faintly in the hearth. On the mantel, soot had half obscured the faded outline of a missing picture frame. A scrap of gilt frame remained, the rest apparently removed. Purbright ran a finger across the empty spot. Something was taken, not burned. Mally pointed to the floor. And this, sir. Among the ash lay the charred remains of an envelope. Only a few words survived, scrawled in dark ink. Ledger. Cundle. To conceal. Purbright straightened. Ah, the ghosts are finally learning to write. He pocketed the fragment carefully. Outside, the onlookers were in full chorus. Mrs. Glossop declared that wicked forces resent investigation. Miss Teatley, calmer but curious, murmured to a reporter from the Chronicle that justice is like good literature. It smoulders before it enlightens. Mrs. Sproat, meanwhile, insisted she had seen a tall figure running from the back gate. When questioned, her description wavered between, like that tramp, and possibly a solicitor in distress. Purbright smiled politely. An easy mistake, Mrs. Sproat. The professions share similar footwear. The next morning, Mr. Cundell appeared at the station, pale and agitated. Inspector, he began, I must protest this campaign of suspicion. My wife is quite distraught. People are saying— People, said Purbright, say many things when deprived of entertainment. You should hear them at the hairdresser's. This fire, it's outrageous. My name's being dragged into it. On the contrary, said Purbright mildly. It seems your name was already present inside the house. Cundell froze. I beg your pardon? Purbright laid the burnt scrap of paper on the desk. Recognize the handwriting? Cundell's eyes flickered down, then away. I can't be certain. Of course not, said Purbright. Fire does dreadful things to legibility, though curiously, it rarely invents names. Cundell licked his lips. I had nothing to do with this. I'm relieved to hear it, Purbright said gently. Then you won't mind if we search your office? Cundell blanched. Search? On what grounds? Safety, said Purbright. Flaxborough is highly flammable this week. At the solicitor's office, the search produced little at first. Dust, stale tobacco, a small bottle of sherry labelled for medicinal use only. Then, behind a row of obsolete law books, Mally found a locked drawer. Cundell fumbled for a key, insisting it was private correspondence. Inside were two ledgers, their covers marked in Canon Willesden's handwriting. Purbright turned the pages slowly. Within lay a neat account of church collections, and beneath that, pencilled annotations in a different hand, sums diverted to consulting fees. Your hand, Mr. Cundell? Cundell said nothing. Purbright looked up mildly. It seems the late Canon was a generous man, to his solicitor, at least. He knew about it, Cundell burst out. He said it was compensation for years of unpaid work. And Mrs. Willesden, she found out and threatened to expose you. Cundell slumped. She wanted the money back. I told her I'd settle the accounts once the parish transferred funds. Then she died. Purbright nodded slowly. How convenient. And after her death, the ledgers vanished, of course, and the property conveniently secured. I kept them safe, Cundell said desperately, in case the diocese asked. They didn't, said Purbright, but someone else did. That evening, Purbright sat in his office with Miss Teatley's note spread beside the recovered ledgers. He spoke half to himself. The handwriting on the burnt paper, hers, perhaps, Mrs. Willesden's, a warning hidden and later found. Someone discovered it, feared what it proved and tried to destroy it. But why stage a candlelight scene first? Mally ventured. To make people think it was haunted? Purbright smiled faintly. An imaginative theory, Mally, but even ghosts don't bother with candles unless they have company. Someone wanted to frighten off curiosity before the papers could surface. And that someone? Purbright leaned back. Our solicitor is too cowardly, our vicar too scrupulous, but a third person, someone unseen, clever, capable of entering quietly? Now that's interesting. Who? I don't know yet, said Purbright softly. But I imagine they'll try again. The first fire was rehearsal. 2 nights later, the rehearsal became performance. At 11, as Purbright worked late at his desk, a constable burst in, breathless. "Sir, at the rectory again! Smoke seen from the upper floor!" By the time Purbright reached the scene, the flames were climbing the old staircase. The firemen were already at work, and Mally shouted through the noise, "Found the source! Hidden compartment behind a wall panel. Must have caught when something inside ignited." "Inside?" Purbright called. "What's inside?" Mally returned minutes later, carrying a small, half-burned journal, bound in cracked leather. Purbright opened it carefully. The first legible line read, "C.W. If anything happens to me, the truth lies in the second ledger. E.C. cannot be trusted." He smiled grimly. Mrs. Willisden, writing to herself, or to us, a decade late. "Who tried to burn it now?" Mally asked. Purbright closed the journal. "The same person who lit the candle the first night. They're trying to erase not memory, but guilt, and they've run out of wax." The fire died before dawn. The rectory stood blackened but unbroken, as if determined to outlive its reputation. As Purbright watched the smoke rise pale against the morning sky, he murmured, "Curious thing, Mally. Some people light candles for comfort, others for confession." Mally glanced at him. "So—"
"What now, sir?" "Now," said Purbright, eyes on the smouldering house, "we invite our guests back to tea, and see which one cannot bear the smell of smoke." For Inspector Purbright, the business of unravelling deceit was not unlike brewing tea. One required patience, the right temperature, and a quiet refusal to stir too soon. On the Monday, following the second fire, he found himself at Miss Teatley's book-lined cottage, accepting a cup of Darjeeling with the air of a man inspecting evidence disguised as refreshment. Miss Teatley was, as ever, composed, the sort of woman who would tidy a crime scene out of literary sympathy. She sat opposite Purbright, the morning light catching the polished spines behind her. "I read about the second fire," she said, stirring delicately. "The Chronicle is calling it the Rector's Revenge. Quite dramatic, for Flaxborough." "Journalism," said Purbright, "is merely gossip with better punctuation." She smiled. "And your own version?" "A fire that started itself would be remarkable," Purbright said mildly, "but not as remarkable as one that failed twice to burn what truly matters." "Which is?" "The truth, though I suspect it's already a little scorched." Miss Teatley's eyes glimmered. "You've found something." "Enough," said Purbright. "Not quite enough to accuse, but enough to invite conversation." "Ah," she said with quiet amusement, "your favourite method." He told her, between careful sips, what they had discovered: the ledgers, the burnt note, the journal bearing the late Mrs. Willisden's initials. Miss Teatley listened attentively, only interrupting to pour more tea. "Then the solicitor was stealing from the parish?" "Possibly, though theft is rarely so simple. I suspect partnership, perhaps reluctant, perhaps silent." "With the canon?" Purbright nodded. "Or someone who succeeded him. Reverend Moffat, for instance, though I rather think he's being played like an upright piano, noisy, but not responsible for the tune." "Then who?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Patience, Miss Teatley. The guilty tend to reveal themselves when offered an opportunity for good manners." She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You mean to stage something?" "Not quite a stage, well, more a tea table. I'm inviting our key participants to join me at the station this week. a small civil discussion about old church finances and modern fires. Will they come?
Oh, certainly,
said Purbright. Flaxborough's upper crust would rather attend an inquest than be suspected of ignoring one. Miss Teatley chuckled softly. You sound almost fond of them.
I am,
said Purbright, in the way one is fond of chess pieces, predictable, but occasionally capable of surprise. When he rose to leave, she walked him to the door. Inspector, she said, be careful. You sound as if you admire your adversary.
Not admiration, Purbright said gently.
Only curiosity. The cleverest criminals in Flaxborough are the ones who believe they've done something understandable.
And this one?
He paused. I think they believe they've done something kind. At the station that afternoon, Purbright's office resembled a drawing room rather than a place of interrogation. A tea service stood on the table. The fire in the grate added a faint domestic warmth. He had sent polite notes to Mr. Cundell, Reverend Moffat, and Miss Beresford, inviting them to assist with clarifications in the matter of parish documentation. Cundell arrived first, perspiring as ever. Moffat followed, pale but dutiful. Miss Beresford came last, clutching a folder of papers like a shield. Purbright welcomed them with quiet courtesy. I thought we might discuss the unfortunate series of events concerning the rectory, and perhaps relieve the town of its more supernatural anxieties. He poured tea, handing cups with precision. Milk, Reverend? None, Mr. Cundell, I recall. Cundell flinched slightly. The inspector's recall was too accurate. They sipped in uneasy silence. It's curious, Purbright began, how documents acquire moral weight when neglected. These ledgers, for example. He gestured to the 2 recovered volumes. They contain a story rather less spiritual than one might wish. Cundell cleared his throat. Those were private notes, Inspector, of no interest to the public. Quite so, Purbright agreed. Particularly since one of the public happened to die shortly after questioning them. Moffat's teacup rattled faintly.
You mean Mrs. Willisden?
I do, and then there's the journal found in the fire. It accuses one E.C. of deceit, no surname, though your own, Mr. Cundell, does spring to mind. Cundell set down his cup too quickly. Coincidence? Perhaps. But coincidences do like company. Miss Beresford, who had been silent until now, said nervously, Inspector, if you mean to suggest... Purbright turned his gaze upon her, gentle but sharp. Miss Beresford, you were parish secretary then as now? You handled the correspondence? You might recall a particular envelope, one that contained this. He drew from his drawer the burnt scrap. Original ledger. Cundell, to conceal. She paled. That note was found in the vestry years ago. I thought it gossip. It was evidence, said Purbright softly. And someone wanted it destroyed, but the fire failed. Twice. I wonder why. No one answered. Purbright looked at each in turn, then said, The truth is remarkably untheatrical. A woman discovered her husband's financial deceit, wrote a note, hid it. Years later, someone feared it would re-emerge, so they created a ghost to distract suspicion, and when that failed, they tried to burn the proof. He turned to Moffat. Tell me, Reverend, when you went with Mr. Cundell to the rectory, who suggested the visit? Moffat hesitated. He did, but I agreed willingly. I wanted to clear the place for parish use. Of course, said Purbright. And yet the door was already unlocked. Someone had visited before you, someone who had reason to retrieve or destroy old documents. He paused, letting the silence thicken. Then he said quietly, Miss Beresford, when did you last see Mrs. Willisden alive? Her eyes widened.
Me? Why, it must have been a day or 2 before her death.
She came to the vestry upset, said she was sending something to the diocese. I I offered to post it for her." "And did you?" "Yes, I think so. I can't remember." Purbright smiled faintly. "But you can, can't you? The letter never reached them. You burned it. Because you thought she was mistaken. Because you were protecting the canon's name, and Mr. Cundle's as well." Tears welled in her eyes. "I only wanted to spare the church scandal. She was ill, distraught." Purbright nodded gently. "And now, 10 years later, you've been trying to finish what you began, to remove the last traces, the note, the journal. You even lit that first candle, didn't you? To make people afraid to go near the house." She covered her face. "I didn't mean the fire. I only wanted it gone." "Gone," Purbright repeated softly, "is a word with very long consequences." Later, when the others had gone, Miss Teatley arrived with a small paper bag of scones. "Well?" she asked quietly. "It was the secretary," Purbright said. 10 years of guilt disguised as guardianship. She tried to preserve respectability and ended by imitating the very deceit she once hid. Miss Teatley sighed. "You'll charge her?" "Perhaps," he said, "though pity is a poor prosecutor." He poured them both tea. "Strange thing," Miss Teatley murmured. "All this over a few candles and a few lies." Purbright smiled faintly. "Flaxborough burns brightest over trifles." Inspector Purbright was not a man who believed in traps, only in circumstances arranged for honesty to prove inconvenient. He spent the next 2 days ensuring that the circumstances of Miss Beresford's honesty would be as inconvenient as possible. At his request, Sergeant Malley made discreet mention in town that new evidence had been recovered from the rectory fire. Something written in ink, mostly legible. Within hours, half of Flaxborough had improved the rumour into a full confession by the ghost herself. By evening, Purbright knew Miss Beresford would have heard. The following morning she appeared at the station precisely as he expected, clutching her handbag, pale but composed. "I had to come," she said. "There's so much misunderstanding." Purbright gestured to the chair. "Misunderstanding is the civic sport of Flaxborough, Miss Beresford." "But do sit." She sat, gloved hands clasped. "People are saying dreadful things, that I burned the rectory, that I forged the canon's books." "Neither rumour," Purbright said mildly, "originated here. The truth, you'll find, travels more slowly than malice." She gave a tremulous sigh. "Then you don't believe it?" "I believe in gravity, T, and the moral frailty of parish committees," Purbright said. "Everything else requires evidence." Her mouth twitched in the faintest smile. "I only wanted to protect the church's reputation." "So you said." He looked at her steadily. "And in doing so you became its ghost. The fires, the candle, the letter. All meant to erase what your own conscience refused to forget." She looked away, blinking rapidly. "I thought I could put it right." Mrs. Wilsden's note accused poor Mr. Cundle unjustly. "Ah," said Purbright. "Poor Mr. Cundle, a man who, if not quite innocent, at least had the decency to panic at appropriate moments." "I never meant harm," she burst out. "Only peace, for everyone." "Peace," said Purbright softly, "is often mistaken for concealment. You tried to quiet the past, Miss Beresford, but it only shouted louder." There was a knock at the door. Malley entered, holding a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "This just came by messenger, sir. No name given." Purbright unwrapped it. Inside lay a half-burned candle, its twin moulded edge unmistakable, and a folded note. He opened it, reading aloud. "She'll never tell the rest. Some ghosts deserve company." Purbright looked up sharply. "Where was this delivered?" "Left at the post office, sir. Boy says a gentleman in a hat dropped it off." Purbright turned to Miss Beresford.
whose expression had frozen mid-breath. "Recognize the handwriting?" he asked. Her lips moved soundlessly before she whispered, "Cundell." Purbright nodded. So the solicitor's conscience finally lights up. An hour later, Purbright and Mally stood outside Cundell's office. The door was locked, the blinds drawn. Inside, faint movement, the creak of a chair. Purbright knocked. "Mr. Cundell?" Silence. Then a muffled voice. "Go away." "Ah," Purbright murmured, "a promising opening." He turned the handle. It yielded easily. Cundell sat at his desk, hands flat upon an open envelope. He looked up with a wan smile. "You're late, Inspector. I was about to make my statement." "Splendid," said Purbright. "It saves me the trouble of arresting your typewriter." Cundell gave a thin laugh. "You'll have your confession soon enough, though I'm not the only one. We were both to blame, the Canon and I." He began it. I only continued what he taught me. Purbright said nothing, letting the words spill out. "I didn't kill her," Cundell said quickly. "Mrs. Willisden. She threatened to expose us." "Yes, but she fell down the stairs. An accident, I swear it. Beresford saw her after. Help me." "She helped you?" "Yes. She burned the letter she found, said the parish couldn't stand another scandal. I let her believe that was mercy." Purbright regarded him steadily. "And when she tried to erase the rest, you grew afraid she'd confess." Cundell's shoulders sagged. "So I went there. The fires. Both of them. I wanted to destroy the journals, finish what should have been done years ago, but she'd already taken one. I left the candle to make it seem providential." "Providence," said Purbright, "is rarely impressed by artifice." Cundell buried his face in his hands. "I just wanted it to stop." "It will," Purbright said quietly, "though not quite in the way you hoped." By evening, the solicitor had signed a full statement, and Miss Beresford's complicity was gently but firmly recorded. She would not be charged, at least not yet. Purbright had recommended leniency. He sat alone in his office, dusk settling over Flaxborough. The half-burned candle lay before him, flickering faintly, a curious relic of human frailty. Mally entered, looking thoughtful. "Seems simple in the end," he said. "Money, guilt and panic, nothing supernatural after all." Purbright smiled faintly. "On the contrary, Mally, it's all supernatural. You just have to lower your definition. The invisible forces that drive people, fear, pride, conscience, are far more potent than ectoplasm." "Still," said Mally, glancing at the candle. "Creepy, though. That light in the window?" Purbright nodded. "Guilt has its own luminescence." The next afternoon, he stopped by the library to return Miss Teatley's notebook. "Finished your little experiment?" she asked, amused. "Quite. The subjects reacted predictably. Confession under mild moral pressure." "Will you write it up?" He smiled. "No need. Flaxborough will serialize it before I've finished the report." She poured him tea. "And the candle?" He hesitated. "Still burning in a manner of speaking. I think I'll keep it, as a reminder that truth, however dim, is best approached by small light." She looked at him with the fond tolerance of one who knew his mind too well. "You're a strange man, Inspector Purbright." He smiled faintly. "In Flaxborough, that's almost a compliment." That evening, as darkness folded over the town, Purbright sat at his desk, finishing the final line of his report. He paused, then added a note to himself at the bottom. Observation: the dead seldom return, but the guilty do, usually with tea and explanations. He blew out the candle. The room, and Flaxborough with it, settled back into its customary dim decency.
Flaxborough prided itself on being a place where scandals were best concluded before tea. Inspector Purbright, being a man of civic sympathy, arranged matters accordingly. On Thursday afternoon, in the small meeting room of the town hall, he assembled a polite selection of Flaxborough's better-informed citizens. Mr. Cundle, his complexion the colour of warm parchment; Miss Beresford, pale and resigned; Reverend Moffat, trembling between piety and curiosity; and Miss Teatley, who had volunteered as observer for posterity. A few councillors had also invited themselves, sensing the faint odour of respectability being freshly disinfected. Purbright entered last, carrying a thin folder and his unhurried manner. "Thank you all for coming," he said. "It's so much tidier when truth can be shared communally." He placed the folder on the table. "The matter of the rectory fires and the so-called Candlelight visitor is now, I believe, settled." Cundle gave a short, brittle laugh. "You mean to say there's been no haunting?" Purbright regarded him mildly. "Only of the moral variety, Mr. Cundle, the most persistent kind." He began with the story as if it were an after-dinner anecdote. 10 years ago, Canon Willisden had discovered that his solicitor, Mr. Cundle, had been quietly reallocating parish funds to his own use. Confronted, the canon had preferred silence, fearing scandal more than sin, and justified the theft as compensation for professional generosity. When Mrs. Willisden learned of it, she wrote a note in a private journal, recording what she knew and resolving to reveal it to the diocese. Before she could, she fell, perhaps by accident, perhaps not, down the rectory stairs. The truth was buried with her. Purbright's gaze drifted toward Cundle, who sat rigid, eyes fixed on the tablecloth. "The ledgers," Purbright continued, "vanished soon after. Miss Beresford, then the parish secretary, helped Mr. Cundle tidy the estate. She found the note and burned it, believing she was saving the church from disgrace. In time, she came to see the act as both virtuous and tragic. So when whispers of irregularity resurfaced last month, she tried again to erase them." He turned a page. "She entered the rectory by the old garden quay, lit a candle, the same kind once kept by Mrs. Willisden, and staged what she hoped would pass for a haunting, a gentle warning to deter curiosity." There was a faint murmur in the room. Miss Beresford's hands trembled in her lap. Purbright's tone remained courteous. When that failed, when the town's curiosity only increased, she returned, attempting to burn the remaining journal. But she wasn't alone. He looked directly at Cundle. "You followed her, didn't you? You feared she would confess. The second fire began because you tried to finish the job and silence her in the same breath." Cundle's lips parted, but no sound came. "You failed," Purbright went on softly. "The journal survived, and so did she." Reverend Moffat cleared his throat nervously.
"Then, the apparition of the candlelight, it was all a mixture of remorse and timing," said Purbright. "One conscience trying to hide the past, another trying to erase it. Flaxborough's ghosts, as usual, were merely the living seen through smoke." He closed the folder gently. "The law will have to take its course, of course, but I've recommended leniency for Miss Beresford. She committed folly, not malice. As for Mr. Cundle, the diocesan auditors will find his accounting as creative as his conscience." There was silence for a moment, the quiet, decorous sort peculiar to English rooms where tragedy has just been tidied into respectability. Then Miss Teatley said, in her calm librarian's voice, "I suppose, Inspector, the moral is that truth always leaves a footprint, even in dust." Purbright smiled faintly. "Or that lies, Miss Teatley, are clumsier dancers than they believe." After the meeting, As the small assembly dispersed into polite relief, Reverend Moffat lingered. "Inspector," he said hesitantly, "I don't know how to thank you. This whole matter, it's been dreadful. The church—" Purbright interrupted gently. "The church will recover, Reverend. It always does. Respectability is its most renewable resource." The young man coloured faintly. "And Miss Beresford?" "She'll resign quietly," Purbright said. "Flaxborough will forgive her in 6 months, provided she doesn't attend the bazaar too soon." He put on his hat. "Take care of your sermons, Reverend. They're less dangerous than ledgers, but not by much." That evening, Purbright walked home through the square. The October dusk had softened the town into shadow and gaslight. Shop fronts glowed faintly. The post office clock ticked with municipal self-importance. At the edge of the churchyard, he paused and looked toward the old rectory. It stood empty again, the windows dark, the gate half open, the air around it smelling faintly of rain and extinguished smoke. From somewhere beyond the lilacs came the faint scrape of a gardener's trowel. Old Peveril, no doubt, returning to his habits. Purbright watched for a while, then said quietly to no one in particular, "Let the house rest now, it's earned it." He turned to leave, but something, perhaps a flicker of reflection from a passing car, caught the window pane. For a second, it looked as though a small candle burned once more in the drawing room. Purbright smiled faintly, tipping his hat toward it. "If you must," he murmured, "make it a short vigil." The light vanished. Later that night he sat at his desk, writing the closing line of his report. Case concluded. Town tranquil. Moral. Ghosts require no bodies, only memories sufficiently restless. He paused, drew a small candle from his drawer, the same twin of the first, and lit it. The flame wavered gently, then steadied, casting long shadows over his
papers. "Good night, Flaxborough," he said softly. He blew it out. By the following week, Flaxborough had folded the Candlelight affair neatly into its catalogue of polite curiosities. The Chronicle ran a brief editorial. "It is reassuring that our local constabulary, with its customary tact, has once again demonstrated that the supernatural yields gracefully to sound administration." The editor was congratulated at the Conservative Club for keeping the tone measured, and Mrs. Glossop, over her tea-urn, declared it a nice ending. Not too sordid, just local enough. The rectory, meanwhile, had been boarded up, the diocese murmuring about eventual redevelopment. The garden, overrun with lilac and nettles, looked oddly peaceful, as though relieved of its burden of secrets. Inspector Purbright read the newspaper article in his office, allowed himself a small, sardonic smile, and folded it precisely into the bin. Sergeant Malley entered with a sheaf of forms. "Statements all typed, sir. Miss Beresford's resigned from the parish. Mr. Cundall's out on bail." Purbright nodded. "Yes, no doubt he'll soon rediscover faith in his solicitor." Malley grinned faintly. "The Reverend asked if we'd attend Sunday service in gratitude." "Ah," said Purbright, "tell him gratitude is best expressed by short sermons and punctual endings." Malley hesitated. "What about Miss Beresford, sir?" Purbright leaned back. "A kindly magistrate will give her a conditional discharge, I imagine. She's suffered her sentence already. 10 years of it." He looked at the window where sunlight slanted across the desk. "People think guilt is heavy, but it's the carrying that wears them down." That afternoon, Purbright walked through the market square. The stalls were bright again, apples, chrysanthemums, fish, displayed with the air of stoic mortality. Life in Flaxborough had resumed its routine, which was to say, its gossip had merely changed subjects. He paused outside the tea-cosy cafe. Mrs. Glossop spotted him through the window and waved, beckoning him in. He entered, knowing resistance was useless. "Inspector," she said, pouring him tea without asking. "We've all been so reassured by your work. My sister in Louth says it's just like something on the wireless, though she still thinks the ghost might have been real." Purbright stirred his tea. "If so, Mrs. Glossop, it displayed commendable civic engagement." She laughed heartily. "Well, you've certainly kept us entertained. Poor Miss Beresford, and such a shock. I always said she was too tidy to be entirely innocent." "Indeed," said Purbright, sipping. "One should always be suspicious of perfection. It so often conceals renovation." Later that evening, Purbright made his way down Chancel Lane one last time. The twilight mist gathered like memory above the hedges. At the rectory gate, he paused. A faint smell of damp. Stone lingered, and something else, subtler. Beeswax, warmed by the day's last light. Old Thomas Peveril was there, pruning the lilacs with more optimism than efficiency. "Evening, Inspector," he said. "Looks quieter now, eh?" "Quieter, yes. Wiser, doubtful," Purbright replied. Peveril chuckled, tapping his pipe. "You think there'll be more trouble?" "Not here," Purbright said. "Flaxborough's ghosts don't travel far. They prefer home comforts." Peveril nodded. "Nice work, though. We all knew you'd sort it. Town feels lighter somehow." "Possibly," said Purbright, "but it's remarkable how weightless remorse becomes once the guilty are elsewhere." He looked up at the house, its dark windows blank. "Funny thing about empty buildings, Mr. Peveril. They seem to listen." "Aye," the old man said. "Same as churches, I reckon. Full of what's left unsaid." Purbright smiled faintly. A very sound theology. He tipped his hat and walked on. Back at home, Purbright lit a small lamp on his desk. The flame steadied, gold against the gathering dark. He took out his notebook, not for a report this time, but a few private reflections. Flaxborough remains as it was, absurd, admirable, and incurably human. Crimes here are seldom monstrous. They are simply misplaced virtues. Every deceit begins as a kindness untidy enough to rot. He paused, then added one final line. "And light, however small, will find the dust." He set down the pen, leaned back, and listened. Outside, the evening bells of St. Swithin's drifted softly over the rooftops, not triumphant, merely punctual. He smiled. "A rare quality, punctuality," he murmured, "even in justice." From somewhere down the street, a single candle's glow flickered briefly in a window, then went out. Purbright closed his eyes, content to let Flaxborough slip once more into its habitual dim peace.